There's a moment in that press conference, you can find it if you look for it, it's on record, where a reporter just asks it straight out. No cushioning, no easing into it. Do you believe Jack and Lily are alive or dead? And Staff Sgt. Rob McCamon, who leads major crime for Nova Scotia RCMP, doesn't dodge it. He doesn't say, we remain hopeful. He doesn't say, we can't speculate. He says, and I want you to actually hear this, not just read it. I think the chances that Jack and Lily are alive are very slim. That's it. That's the sentence. Coming from the man actually running this investigation, a year after two small children vanished from a house in rural Nova Scotia, in front of cameras, on the record. I keep coming back to that word. Slim. Not impossible, not we've given up. Slim. Which is its own kind of unbearable, honestly, because slim still leaves a door open, just barely, and I think that's almost harder to sit with than a flat no would be. So today I want to actually walk through why. Not the whole case history again. If you've been following this, you already know the outline. You know about May 2nd, you know about the basement door and the search that covered kilometers of forest. I'm not going to redo all of that. What I want to do is slow down on this one specific thing. Why would the person actually running this investigation say that out loud on camera? Because that's not a casual thing for an RCMP officer to say. These are people trained specifically to be careful with language, to not speculate publicly. And here's a senior officer saying the quiet part, the part everyone's been thinking privately for months, out loud. Let's start with the search itself because I think the scale of it gets lost sometimes in how the story gets retold. 24 separate ground search and rescue teams. That's not a number I'm rounding for effect. That's the actual documented count from RCMP's own updates. Alongside them, specialized units brought in from across the country. Cadaver dogs. And I want to be precise about what that means because it matters. Cadaver dogs aren't general search dogs. They're trained specifically to detect human remains. In September of 2025, 4 months after the disappearance, those dogs covered a 40-kilometer radius around the property. 40 kilometers. Think about what that actually is for a second. That's not a backyard search. That's not checking the woods behind the house. That's an area larger than most small cities gone over systematically by dogs trained for exactly one purpose, and they found nothing. Drones, helicopters, water searches, because there's terrain near the property that includes streams and low-lying wet areas. Hundreds of volunteers at various points, walking grid patterns through brush so thick that people who've been out there have described having to physically climb over fallen trees just to move forward. A year of that, and the physical evidence recovered from all of it amounts to a few boot prints in 2 different sizes found in the woods, pieces of a pink blanket confirmed by family to belong to Lily, 1 piece found in a tree, another piece found later in a trash bag at the end of the driveway. That's genuinely strange if you think about it. How does part of a child's blanket end up in 2 completely different places like that? Nobody's ever explained it publicly. That's the sum total, after a year, of the most extensive search Nova Scotia has ever mounted for missing children. A few boot prints, some blanket fragments, nothing else. And I think once you actually sit with that, the scale of what they searched against the almost nothing they found, you start to understand why very slim isn't a hopeless officer giving up. It's closer to a mathematical statement. If 2 small children, Lily was 6, Jack was 4, had wandered into that terrain and were still out there, alive a year later, the search that's already happened would have found something, a body, remains, anything. The absence of that after this much searching, this thoroughly, starts to point somewhere else. Not toward an answer, just away from the wandering off theory that was the first most natural explanation back in May of 2025. I want to be really careful here actually because I think this is exactly the point where a lot of coverage goes wrong. The absence of evidence that they wandered off and got lost doesn't automatically mean something sinister happened. It just means that specific, simplest explanation, the one everyone hoped for in the first weeks, doesn't fit the evidence anymore. That's different from saying investigators know what is fit. They've been clear repeatedly that they don't. Let's talk about what evaluating all scenarios actually means, because RCMP has used that phrase a lot, and I think it's worth unpacking rather than just repeating it. A spokesperson said, in one of the more recent updates, investigators are evaluating all scenarios, including criminality. That's a shift if you track the language carefully over the past year. Early on in the first weeks, officials said there was no evidence of a criminal offense. That specific phrase, no evidence of criminality, has appeared less and less as the months went by and been replaced with broader language. Not confirmation of anything, just a widening of what's on the table. There's also this, and it's public record, it came out through court documents that media organizations had to formally apply to get unsealed. So this isn't rumor, this is filed paperwork. In the months before Lily and Jack disappeared, their mother, Malaya Brooks Murray, described in a police interview that her partner, the children's stepfather, Daniel Martell, would, in her words, try to block her, hold her down, and that he'd once pushed her. That's directly from the unsealed documents, reported by CBC and other outlets who did the legal work to get access to them. I want to be exact about what that is and isn't. That's an account given by one person in an interview with police, describing their relationship. It is not a criminal charge related to the children's disappearance. Martell has publicly denied physically abusing her and has said the narrative around this is meant to paint him as guilty of something he says he didn't do. Those documents don't resolve anything about what happened to Lily and Jack specifically. What they do is add texture. They tell you that the home these children were living in the months leading up to their disappearance, wasn't a simple, uncomplicated household. There were tensions. There was, according to her account, physical conflict between the adults. That on its own still doesn't answer the central question. Plenty of homes have conflict between adults, and that has nothing to do with children going missing. I'm not going to draw a line I can't actually draw, but it is part of the full picture RCMP has had access to for over a year now, while they were also running that 40-kilometer search and finding almost nothing. Here's something else that's genuinely new, and I don't think it's gotten the attention it probably should have. Before Lily and Jack disappeared, this is confirmed, it's been reported by the Globe and Mail among others, a provincial child protection social worker had visited the family's home, investigating a report of suspected abuse or neglect. RCMP has confirmed they interviewed that social worker as part of their investigation. Sit with that for a second. A government child protection worker had already been inside that home, looking specifically at whether these children were safe before any of this happened. That's not speculation from me. That's documented, and RCMP themselves have said it's part of what they're actively looking into. Staff Sgt. McCamon, when asked about it directly, said, "We have looked at their movements in the days prior and the kind of things that were going on in their lives. That is part of our investigative inquiry." I keep thinking about the timing of that. A welfare check, or at least a concern serious enough to bring in a social worker sometime before May the 2nd. And then on May 2nd, 2 children are gone. Again, I want to slow down and be honest about the limits of what that tells us. A CPS visit before a tragedy doesn't automatically mean the tragedy, and the visit are connected in the way you might assume. Families get reported to child services for all kinds of reasons, and the overwhelming majority of those situations do not end in a child disappearing. I'm not going to build a theory out of one fact just because it's dramatic, but it is a fact, it's confirmed. And it's part of why Very Slim isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from a full year of an investigation that's had access to details the public is only slowly getting pieces of. Let's go back to that press conference, actually, because there was more said that day that I think deserves attention, beyond just the one quote everyone's focused on. McCamon was also asked directly whether the public perception that this investigation has stalled, that it's not getting anywhere, was fair. And his answer was interesting because he didn't just deny it. He said, "Ever since this began, the RCMP has been actively engaged in pursuing the answers as to what happened with Jack and Lily. We've engaged units from across Canada. We continue to engage those units to support us where needed. We've brought in specialized services for any area that's required, whether it be testing or looking at our social media for AI or whatever other specialized areas, human remains detection dogs, and we won't stop." I want to pull one specific thing out of that, because I don't think it's been talked about enough. AI, analyzing social media. That's a genuinely new tool for an investigation like this, using artificial intelligence to comb through social media activity, presumably looking for patterns, connections, movements, anything that might connect to the timeline. That's not something RCMP would have had in this form, even a few years ago. It tells you they're not just rewalking the same physical ground over and over. They're bringing in tools that didn't really exist for missing persons cases a decade back. And it also tells you something else. If you think about it honestly, if a case like this needs AI social media analysis a full year in, it means the conventional leads, the obvious ones, the physical evidence, the witness statements, those have been largely exhausted. You don't reach for a tool like that as your first move. You reach for it when you've already done the traditional police work and you're now trying to find threads you might have missed. There's a criminologist who's spoken publicly about this case, and I mentioned this in an earlier video, but I think it's worth returning to here because it directly connects to the very slim statement. She's called this case profoundly rare. Her reasoning is statistical, not emotional. Most missing children cases, the overwhelming majority, resolve within days, not weeks, days. When a case involving two young siblings disappearing together stretches past a year with essentially no physical trace beyond a few boot prints in blanket fragments, that puts it in genuinely rare territory. She's compared it, as one of the only similar cases she could think of, to the disappearance of two sisters in Chicago back in 2001, a case that, more than 2 decades later, is still unsolved. I bring that up not to scare anyone, and not because I think it tells us anything definitive about how this ends. I bring it up because it's useful context for understanding why an experienced investigator, a year in, would use a word like slim instead of something softer. Statistically, cases that go this long with this little physical evidence without resolving quickly, historically in documented outcomes across similar cases, skew toward tragic endings far more often than toward the missing person eventually being found safe. That's not a guarantee of anything. I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters. Historically more likely is not the same as certain. There are cases, rare but real, where children have been found alive years after disappearing, sometimes under circumstances nobody predicted. That possibility hasn't been eliminated. RCMP hasn't said it's been eliminated. But when you're the person actually holding all the evidence, all the search data, all the interview transcripts, and you're asked point blank whether you think they're alive, and your honest answer is very slim, that's not you speaking from pessimism. That's you speaking from the accumulated weight of everything you've actually seen that the public hasn't. I want to bring the grandmother into this for a moment, because I think her words, more than almost anyone's, capture what a year like this actually costs a family. Cindy Murray, the children's maternal grandmother, spoke to CBC around the 1-year mark. She said, "We're just devastated that there's still no answers after a year. I can't really put it in words how hard this has been on myself and my family. We're still trying to stay positive and hope for the best, but it's very tiring. It's a lot mentally." I don't think there's anything I can add to that, honestly. That's just what it is. A year of not knowing, carried by people who love these two kids while a professional investigator uses the word slim in public, and while search teams keep going back into the woods and volunteers keep organizing new searches. There was one, actually, just before the anniversary on April 26th, led by a volunteer search organization out of Ontario. And during that search, they found a new child-sized boot print, small, pressed into the mud, unconfirmed as belonging to either child, as far as any public record shows, but new, which tells you people are still out there, still looking a year in, even while the officer running the case tells reporters he thinks the odds are slim. There's something almost unbearable about holding both of those things at once. A family and a community that hasn't stopped looking, and an investigator who, when pushed directly, tells the truth as he sees it, even though it's not the answer anyone wants. Let's talk, briefly, about where the other piece of this, the criminal case against Daniel Martel, actually stands, because it's connected to the timeline in a way that matters. Even though RCMP has stated clearly that this specific case is not related to the children's disappearance. Martel was arrested in late January of 2026 on charges of assault, sexual assault, and unlawful confinement involving an adult complainant whose identity is protected by a publication ban. Those alleged incidents are said to have occurred between September of 2024 and March of 2025, so notably in the months leading directly up to when Lily and Jack disappeared. He was arraigned in March. The Crown elected to proceed by indictment, meaning if there's a conviction, it carries more serious penalties than a summary conviction would. His case was delayed multiple times, first from March to May, and then again with the Crown attorney citing the need for additional disclosure, pushed to July 7th when he was due to enter a formal election and plea. I want to be precise here because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets blurred into implying something it doesn't. RCMP has stated clearly, more than once, that these charges are separate from the missing children investigation. Martel himself, when a reporter asked directly whether he thought the charges had anything to do with Lily and Jack's case, said no, and added that RCMP had already said as much. He's maintained his innocence throughout, on both fronts. He said in his words that he never physically abused Malaysia, and he's consistently denied any involvement in the children's disappearance. So what do we actually do with that timeline? I think the honest answer is we don't draw a conclusion from it. It's not evidence of anything regarding Lily and Jack specifically. What it does show is that this is a case sitting at the center of two separate serious investigations, happening in parallel in the same small community involving the same person during roughly the same window of time. That's unusual. It's worth knowing. It is not the same thing as proof of anything. So back to the actual question. Why very slim? I think if you pull all of this together, the 40-kilometer cadaver dog search that found nothing, the year without a single confirmed sighting, the shift in RCMP's language from no evidence of criminality toward evaluating all scenarios, including criminality, the unsealed court documents describing tension and alleged physical conflict in the home, the CPS visit before any of this happened, the use of AI tools a year in because conventional leads have apparently been exhausted, you start to understand that very slim isn't a guess. It's the accumulated weight of a full year of investigation, most of which the public will never see in detail, distilled into 2 words by the one person with the clearest view of all of it. And I think that's actually the most honest way to end this. Not with a theory, not with an accusation, because nobody has been charged in connection with Lily and Jack's disappearance. And RCMP has been careful, consistently, not to name anyone as a suspect in that specific case. What we have is a statement made publicly by the officer leading the investigation that reflects everything he's seen and we haven't. Somewhere in Nova Scotia, there's a family that's spent over a year not knowing. A community that keeps organizing searches, keeps finding small things. A boot print, a blanket fragment that never quite become answers. And an investigator who, when asked the hardest possible question, chose honesty over false comfort. The chances that Jack and Lily are alive are very slim. Not zero, not certain. Slim. And maybe that word, more than anything else said in the last year, tells you exactly where this case actually stands.